Corvus Belli was kind enough to send me the new Bakunin TAG model ahead of its release. So I thought this is going to be a great opportunity to see how this new thermoplastic tag builds and also how I painted it up in the official colors. But instead of focusing on the nitty-gritty of the different techniques I used, I wanted to focus more on the decision making and the different choices I made for this paint job. So let's jump into it and talk about some of those decisions.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan from PHLANSMINIATURE, welcome back to the channel. The Stigmata is the new tag for the Nomads, and usually this kind of bigger model from Corvus Belli you would still expect to be in metal because that's how most of my tags are, but these new ones are actually made out of thermoplastic. It doesn't have this like nice heft to it that the metal models used to have, but on the other hand, it's extremely detailed still, so I would say it's as detailed as the metal ones. I wouldn't be able to tell once it's painted whether it's metal or not, other than the weight. I've already painted one of these thermoplastic ones before, that was the Shakush, and you can actually watch the video on the channel as well. I'm going to link it here. And that one was a bit of a pain to assemble. But fortunately, that's absolutely not the case with the Stigmata. It has barely any mold lines that were in the way. I had zero issues putting it together. Maybe the only problem I had was that there is no other picture of it yet because there is no like rotating picture on the website. So I just couldn't see how exactly this like skirt in the back should fit. So I made my best guess based on the picture that I have, but I'm not 100% sure that's exactly how it was supposed to be put together. But in terms of overall assembly and also painting, it's way easier to deal with this than with the metal ones, that's for sure, because you don't have to wash it. I just took it out of the box and assembled it and then started priming it and painting it immediately. Especially the priming process is much easier because it just goes on super smoothly. Like if you ever try to prime a metal model, you know how difficult it can be. Sometimes, especially in the nooks and crannies, the primer just doesn't want to go, and this is not the case here. But let's talk about the painting process a little bit and the decisions that I had to make it happen. Knowing the techniques is one thing, and I talk about that a lot in my previous videos. I think especially if you want to watch me paint red armor, I think there's multiple videos now on the channel, so check them out. But sometimes the question is not like how to paint it, but whether you should paint it that way or some other way. And if you follow the channel, you know that the first decision I make is usually always the same one, which is that I'm going to paint it in the official color scheme, the way I imagine the model based on the lore and the official key art. And of course, it's perfectly legitimate to paint it in any other scheme as well, in any other colors, but don't forget that that already is a big decision, since if you paint it in the official colors, somebody already made a lot of choices for you that will make your life easier. The official box art is not only technically beautifully done, but most of the time it also is a very good choice in terms of colors and how they work together. Unless you are an expert in color theory and have a very good eye for this kind of stuff, there is a pretty good chance that you might come up with a scheme that is way less pleasing to the eye, let's say, than the one that you see on the box art. And then it doesn't really matter how good your execution is, like how well you apply the technique, if the colors just don't work together and the whole thing just doesn't look good. Once you decided that you are going to do the official color scheme, either because you like it or because you realize that if you already have the choices made for you, you can actually concentrate on doing it well.
But coming up with official color schemes is probably worth a whole new video, so let's just concentrate on what I did here.
Then you need to make the choices about the colors that you are going to use to achieve that color scheme. And I remember when I started out painting, one of the things I always did was try to hunt for the specific recipe, like in terms of the brand, but also the exact paint that was used. But at some point I also realized that that doesn't matter too much. Like, don't get me wrong, it actually helps you quite a bit, especially in the beginning when you know exactly what paint was used. But what is even more important than that is to understand the thinking process behind choosing those paints. So when I was looking at this box art, for example, for the Stigmata, what I was looking at is what kind of elements are there on the model. There is these reds, there is these whites, and the non-metallic metal elements, and then there is the sword and some green lights. You can also see that the model is kind of dominated by these red elements. That's the most striking feature of the model, and there is also a couple of types of different non-metallics on the model that are also very important.
So now you can actually dig a bit deeper and see what kind of colors were used for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights for the reds, for example.
I've decided to start from the shadows, so I wanted to keep the model black primed and then just build my colors up. So then the first question is, what is my first color? What is the deepest shadow red color that was used on this box art? And my best guesstimation was that the deepest midtones and the shadows are something like a corn red or deep red. So corn red from Citadel or deep red from scale 75, something like that. When I look at the red personally, I usually kind of differentiate two types. One is kind of like a Mephiston red, and the other one is more like a corn red, because I started with Citadel paint. Sometimes I just think in those terms. But basically what we're talking about is a red that has a lot of orange in it, or a red that has a lot of blue and purple in it.
Alright, so now I established that I want to use this bluish purplish kind of red for the red parts of our Mini. Now the question is, what brand and what exact paint am I going to use for that? So for example, why did I go for the deep red from scale 75 instead of, let's say, the corn red from Citadel?
And there are multiple reasons for that, and you can also obviously combine different brands as well. But for me, one, it's personal preference, as well as also where I want to go with the model later on. So for example, here I would like to have some relatively smooth blends without blending too much, and scale 75 excels at that. I could use AK Interactive, and that would cover way better, especially here in the initial stages. I would benefit from it, but later I would have to smooth out a lot more than I need to do with scale 75. And I could have absolutely used corn red here as well, let's say from Citadel. That would work just as well, and you can do that. You can use AK, scale 75, whichever color range you want, as long as you are using a color that is kind of like this.
Okay, so now we have established our base color, but now the next decision is going to be what colors are we going to use to highlight the miniature?
And in order to make those decisions, you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. Like, for example, how high do you want to push the highlights on these particular elements? This question is way more important than you would think, because, for example, me, I was not really thinking about it for a long time during my painting career, and that actually shows on the models that I used to paint, because in the end, you don't want to push the highlights the same way on all the different elements of the model. So let's look at our model here, and in my head at least, his red armor is kind of metallic but kind of matte at the same time, right? It's not as shiny as some of the non-metallic metal parts. Therefore, our highlights shouldn't be as high as we will use on the non-metallic parts. So if I want to make my non-metallics shinier, and let's say on the non-metallic I will use an ivory as my highest highlight, the most white color I'm going to use, then on the red elements I cannot use something like that. I need to use something that is less shiny, less bright. And when I looked at the box art, this is exactly what I saw. It seemed that the red armor elements actually were highlighted up to something like an ice yellow, or like a similar color that is more like a yellowish color than an actual white. So knowing this immediately makes my life easier, because I know that I'm going to be finishing the armor in ice yellow. Therefore, what I could do is I could just start mixing in the ice yellow into my existing red and go up in the highlights like that. And of course, if you know this and you already know some colors that already achieve this without mixing, you can use those as well. I used kind of like a mix of both here. I used a color that was already going in that direction first, and then started mixing in the ice yellow or the equivalent scale 75 version. And of course, this is not just about the color choice, this is also about where to put those highlights. But this is one of the nice things about using the official box art and the official color scheme, because then you can also just use that as your guides as to where to put your highlights. You will probably notice that I occasionally don't put the highlights exactly where you see them on the box art, but I also use colors that are not exactly like the box art. Like, for example, the sword for me is going to be green rather than purple. So it's perfectly fine to deviate as long as you know what you are doing. But as you start out, I think it's just a very nice like hand-holding mechanic that you can use to make sure that you put everything exactly where it is on the box art and then go from there. I think there is absolutely no shame in trying to replicate something that was done by a professional or somebody who's much better than you. And once you did it a couple of times, once you have the experience under your belt, then you can make your own choices.
One very important thing to remember is that yes, you are making these decisions and these choices at this stage, but you can also change them later. You are not logged into them.
For example, if you think that the colors that you chose are just not coming out as saturated as you would want them to, or if something is just not blending as well as you would want to, you can make a glaze and you can apply it with a different color, let's say an ink or a contrast paint, to up the saturation. If you have an airbrush, that's probably the best way to do this, but of course you can do all of this by brush as well. It will just take more time. But with an airbrush, you can blend easily, you can change the tones easily, and you can do basically everything quite fast. So this is the perfect tool to change mistakes or correct mistakes. Also, don't forget that once you painted one part of the model or one element of the model, like in my case it was the red armor first, it might not look exactly like you want it to look, but all the additional elements on the model, all the context is missing. So maybe just leave it for now and then paint everything else, see how it looks, and then you can still make changes later down the road. There are a couple of elements that don't require any kind of decision making though, some things that are just simply universal, and that is you have to make sure that you edge highlight everything properly so that you differentiate the different parts. And the same goes also for blacklining, which is making sure that all the elements or the panels, for example, on the armor are separated not only just by edge highlights, but also by black lines between the different panels. In the end, it doesn't matter what kind of colors you use or what kind of color scheme you go for. You need to make sure that the viewer can differentiate the different parts of the model from each other. They don't just mesh into each other, because this is a mini and everything is tiny on it. So we need to kind of exaggerate the differentiation between different elements.
Okay, I'm done with the most important primary element of this model, which is the red armor. But now we have to work on all the secondary elements, which are still very significant, and those are the different non-metallics as well as the cloth that is hanging at his waist.
The problem that we are facing in a situation like this, and this happens quite a bit with miniature painting, is that you need to differentiate the different materials, even though they actually use very, very similar colors. If you're looking at this model, you can see that there are kind of three whitish elements, or elements that have a lot of white in them on this, which is the darkest one is the non-metallics. Which has a lot of bright spots, of course, but in general their overall tone is a bit darker. Then there is the other non-metallic elements that look way whiter, way closer to a shine. And finally there is this loincloth or tabard or whatever that is hanging at his waist. So what you can do in situations like this is that obviously you can use different colors to represent these, and that's probably what you should do, but you can also use different textures, which I didn't actually do here. You could do that, for example, for the loincloth. I have a couple of videos with other models where I actually use this method, where you could represent something like a fabric type material. But here what I did, I just simply used different colors, but very, very similar colors still.
But what is just as important as the colors, or probably even more so, is how high am I going to go with the highlights on those materials.
Remember my thinking process about the red armor, that it should be a bit less bright than the non-metallics because it should not be as shiny. Now we have to do the same thing for all the different materials here as well. And if you think about it, this is actually a super easy decision to make, because the cloth should be probably way less bright than the non-metallics, especially the highest points should not be as bright. Then the normal non-metallic should be not as bright as these like super reflective, almost whitish elements that it has on the accents. And when I was thinking about this, I also realized that the one thing I don't actually like about the box art is that the loincloth looks almost as bright as those really bright white elements, which should not be the case. So I was trying to do something else with that myself, which in the end I don't think looks as refined as the one that is on the box art, but it still differentiates itself better from the non-metallics than the one on the box art. But you guys tell me in the end, do you like that one better or the one on the box art? I think once again the box art one looks super nicely detailed, but it's just too much of the same color for me, and mine will have a lot of sepia, like yellowish colors in there to differentiate itself from everything else around it. And once I established this pecking order of brightness, basically, I decided that, okay, so non-metallic is non-metallic. I'm going to be starting from the same base color, which is perfectly fine. But then I will mix it up later on, and I will make much bigger and much brighter highlights for the ones that I want to be brighter in the end. In the end, if you want to make something look brighter, all you need to do is you need to make the highlights bigger. And even if you use the same color as your final highlight, if something has more of it, it's gonna look brighter as long as there is contrast as well. Which means that technically I could be using the same color for both types of metals, the brighter and the less bright one. And I could just do much more of the brighter color on the brighter ones. But in the end, I used different colors and more highlights just to even more establish that they are a different thing and they are not exactly the same kind of material.
The way I approach the dark and non-metallics is probably a good example of how you can make your life easier by making your choices simpler. Instead of coming up with a whole list of paints that you're going to be using to establish that element, you can just come up with one main color and the highlight color and start mixing the two.
So the two choices I made here is that my main color is going to be anthracite gray, and then my highest highlight is going to be ivory. Once this decision is made, I know that I'm going to be using these two colors. Now I just have to decide how many different mixes of these two colors I'm going to use. I could use just 3, so I could use the anthracite gray and then a mix of the two and then finally ivory. Or I could have 5, for example. I could be having anthracite gray and then ivory on the top, and in between the two there would be 3 stages with more and more ivory mixed into the anthracite gray.
So how do you decide how many of these mixes you actually need? Is it supposed to be 3 or 5 or maybe even 10?
For me, usually it depends on two factors. First, how big the surface is, because if it's a tiny surface, it doesn't matter if you have 5 or 10, if there is only maybe space for 3 to really show up. And the second factor would be how smooth you want this blend to be. And of course, later you can smooth it out with glazes or with an airbrush, but the more initial mixes you use, the more different stages of color you have on there, the more mixed it will look just organically. It's basically a gradient that we are creating with this, and the more steps or stages there are in this gradient, the more it will look like an actual color transition, a smooth color transition to your eye. So for example, on this halo on his back, it makes a lot of sense to have something like, let's say, 5 different mixes of increasing brightness. But on some of the smaller elements, like for example, some of the armor plates, and especially on this, like these round objects on his shoulder, you won't really be able to see 5. You can easily just paint 3 and you would have the same effect as with 5 on the halo.
And I know that a lot of people are afraid of mixing colors and they just want to have the pot ready, know exactly the recipe and then just use that. But in the end, while it might look easier, it's actually way more complicated, right? Because then you need to find the exact perfect color match and you need to know the exact recipe. Whereas if you mix, you can just find one color and then just put the right highlight into it and keep mixing them up as you go along.
And sure, mixing colors is actually fairly complex, or it can be, right? If you know color theory, if you know exactly what you're doing, you can achieve fantastic things with it. But even if you just use it on a very basic level, it is already very, very potent, and the basic level is really easy. The way I like to approach it and simplify it is, if I want to mix highlights, I think about two things. Do I want something to be saturated or desaturated? If you want something that is colorful and vibrant, then you should mix in orange and yellow into your mixes, especially orange, and then later in the highest highlights, yellow. And if you want something that is more like this non-metallic metal where it goes into white, so it's going to be desaturated, then all you need to do is mix in some whites. I usually tend to avoid normal whites, like pure whites. I would go for an ivory.
And I know that I said that I'm not going to be talking about light placement on this model because it's already on the box art, but turns out that on the back of the model there was a lot of decision making actually happening, and I think it's a great opportunity to talk about that, so let's do it.
First of all, this is actually way easier than you would think. And of course, like with everything, if you want to do this on a very, very, very high level, then it can be very scientific and it can be extremely realistic as well. I've seen some fantastic and mind-blowing arts done this way. But if you want to do it at roughly the same level as I used here, which is not exactly very high, it's a relatively simple light sketch, then it has a lot of just imagination in it and not a lot of science. First of all, I do something that is quite vague. I just use my imagination. I think about the material, the shape, and the light that I would like to do. And I'm thinking about, okay, so there is this thing, for example, on the back, which is going to be metal. It's this weird shape. It has a little bit of a curve to it. How would a light source actually reflect on that thing? And I'll try to imagine it in my mind's eye. At the same time, I know a couple of things. Like, for example, I know how big the surface is, and I know how much I would like to cover with the highlights because I kind of have an idea about how bright I want these things to be. In the case of these metal inlays, flaps, whatever you want to call them, on the skirts, I want them to look like metal. Therefore, it has to have really high contrast. That means that it has to go from almost black to almost white. This surface is actually quite large compared to the model, so if I just do a single transition from, let's say, black to white with anthracite gray in between, then it will look weird, right? Because such a large surface usually would not be just like a single reflection. Okay, that just means that we need to break it up. Therefore, there is going to be multiple reflections on this surface. If it was a smaller surface, I would maybe just go with a single transition, like you can see on the upper leg, where it's basically just a transition from black to white to black with anthracite gray in between, so there is only the middle that is shining. In the end, how many transitions you make is entirely up to you. You can do 2 or 3. In the end, it doesn't matter too much. The more you do, of course, the more intricate it looks, but at some point you hit some diminishing returns.
So let's say we know how many reflections we want and how big we want them to be. Now the question is, what kind of shape are they going to be?
And I usually approach this with 2 things in mind, a little bit of physics and a lot of imagination. And physics is basically what kind of object are we talking about? What is the shape of the thing that you are painting? Is it a flat panel? Is it a cylinder? Is it a sphere maybe? These three categories, so basically flat panel, cylinder and sphere, usually are painted in very different ways, like light reflects on them in a very different way. So I would just encourage you to look up examples either of real life objects and see how the light actually reflects, or just check out how some other painters painted something that looks kind of like one of these shapes. If you really want to drill down to the basics, I would say that look at something and check if the thing is flat or it has a curvature. If it's flat, you can just do a simple transition from one end to the other. And if it has a curvature, then you can do something fancier where it kind of is wider at one side and then it tapers off, like I did, for example, on the arms. In the end, I would suggest to just look up a couple of examples and then try it for yourself, and then build a repertoire of shapes, let's say, that you can use on different surfaces, and then just mix it up a little bit. Later you can figure out some fancier stuff for yourself as you get more proficient at it. A final bit of advice about this is to use an airbrush if you have the opportunity, because it's just fantastic to smoothen out the highlights, which is going to be the bane of your existence. Of course, you can use a really detailed gradient with a lot of mixes in between, and you can then glaze over it and it will be great, but it will never look as great as an airbrush gradient. And also it will take a lot of time. The process of painting a miniature is a lot of fun, but sometimes it can also be very laborious and somewhat repetitive. Therefore, if there is an opportunity to make something faster but just as cool looking or even better, then I think we should take it, and the airbrush is a great opportunity for that. And the end result looks like this.
Thank you very much for watching this video, and thank you very much for Corvus Belli as well for sending it to me ahead of its release. I hope you enjoyed it and found it somewhat useful, and if you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. See you in the next one.